From coal to conservation, tragedy and triumph.
For 144 years, Pennsylvania's Lehigh River was owned by the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. The river was primarily used to transport anthracite coal and pig iron to fuel the Industrial Revolution. This tragically led to the pollution of the Lehigh River. In 1966, State Representative Samuel W. Frank triumphantly helped return ownership to the Commonwealth, sparking the river's restoration, an outdoor recreation industry, and an enhanced quality of life for communities connected to the river. This is a call to action to keep our environment clean. The Lehigh River is the keystone to our Lehigh Valley, and it provided a way of transportation for anthracite coal and pig iron. At that time, the economy was flourishing, but the river was slowly being ruined. Now let's take a look at it from a businessman's point of view.
Jerry Mack owns a rafting, boating, and biking business called Lehighton Outdoor Center. And without the river, his business would not be possible.
The fact that the Lehigh River has such an industrial heritage that people, until even when if I lived here, if I was young, people's wash water still flowed into the Lehigh River, and their toilet water, and the sewer plants and things are not that old on the Lehigh River. So I think currently the challenges, and many of the easy challenges to solve, were solved a long time ago. I think organizations like the Wildlands Conservancy and others are working hard to help alleviate the effects of mine acid drainage, and they would swim in the Lehigh, but before they were allowed to come home, they rinsed off in the canal because the canal was so much cleaner than the Lehigh.
Now let's look at it from a conservation scientist's point of view.
Abigail Padishaw is a conservation scientist at Wildlands Conservancy.
Sure, the Lehigh River is unique in the whole country because it's the only river that was actually privately owned. In 1818, the state granted the rights to the river to the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, and it held on to those rights until 1965, making it the only river that was ever privately owned. And that had a huge impact on the history and the well-being of the river. One of the things that happened was that people who lived here in previous generations, they weren't allowed to get to the river. They couldn't access it, so they couldn't fish in it, they couldn't paddle it, they couldn't play in it. So older generations really have no connection to the Lehigh River. It wasn't until...
Just think about it. If you own a bike and your bike gets a flat tire, you are more likely to get your bike fixed as soon as possible. But if the same thing happened to a person down the street's bike that you didn't know, you would be less likely to want to fix it because it doesn't belong to you. This is what happened to the Lehigh River. The Lehigh River didn't belong to the people, so it was not prioritized.
It wasn't until 1965 that a state representative named Samuel Frank actually wrote a bill and sponsored it in the House of Representatives to actually take back ownership of the Lehigh for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So the most important piece of environmental legislation that impacted the Lehigh River by far is the Clean Water Act. And what that did really was set up a system by which the federal government required the states to assess their waterways and to set designated uses for their waterways and then do monitoring. And then they would collect this water quality data, and if water quality currently didn't support the designated uses, then the state had to come up with a plan to remediate the waterways and get them back to their designated uses. And what the Clean Water Act did was establish this permit system for things like sewage treatment plants and industrial discharges, which before the Clean Water Act were allowed to just discharge their effluent and their waste untreated into the river. So really the Clean Water Act was the biggest piece of environmental legislation that changed the Lehigh River for a long time. How has public opinion changed about the Lehigh River? So it was probably in the 1950s, early 1950s, that people started to think about and write about the environment. I'm sure that you guys know Rachel Carson. She published Silent Spring in 1962 to warn the public about the dangers of pesticides. Aldo Leopold published a Sand County Almanac in 1949, where he introduced the concept of a land ethic, basically the idea of people being responsible for the land that they occupy. And there were many others who really started writing about the environment in that period of time, and those works really became part of the sort of public discussion. And as the concern for the environment kind of became elevated during that period of time, you saw the first Earth Day in 1970, and that led to things like the passage of the Clean Water Act, also the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act were all passed right at that same time in the 70s, when people really started to understand the impact that they were having on the environment and the impact that the environment had on their health. So the Lehigh River was very much impacted and is still impacted today by its industrial past. And I think of three main things: deforestation, the damming of the Lehigh, and coal mining and abandoned mine drainage. So all of the forests in the upper Lehigh were actually cut down at a period of time, and all of that timber was sent down market into places like Philadelphia and beyond. The Lehigh River was dammed to transport goods down to Philadelphia. There were at least 20 dams on the main stem of the Lehigh River. And with the final dam that was placed in Easton, at the confluence of the Lehigh and the Delaware, migratory fish like American shad were permanently extirpated from the Lehigh, and that permanently changed the ecology of the river. And that condition pretty much remains today. And then, of course, we had anthracite coal mining, which started in the early 1700s. And the Lehigh River was used to transport coal. So the Lehigh had lots and lots of coal silt, and it was very, very polluted at that time. But today, still, we have abandoned mine drainage, which is a real legacy environmental problem for the Lehigh River. So what they used to do is coal would be mined in these deep mines, and when they got all the coal that they could out of the mine at that time, then they would just abandon the mine. They would just walk away from it and move somewhere else. And a lot of these mines are still like that today. So when it rains, surface water goes into the mines and it interacts with all the coal that's left there, and it picks up all kinds of pollutants and becomes very acidic. And all that water eventually makes its way into the Lehigh even today. So at this point, it's about 70 years since the collapse of that industry in this region, but we are still dealing with those legacy environmental impacts. So the watershed itself is changing very much, and has been changing very much. I think is that people are a lot more connected to the Lehigh River now. There's a lot more opportunities for people to get outside.
Now let's look at it from a historian's point of view.
Martha Capwell Fox is a historian from the Lehigh Canal Museum. She teaches people about the history of the river.
No, they had no idea that it was bad for the environment when they began to mine coal. And it can get to the point where it actually will completely kill any life in a stream. And so that's still a challenge that Pennsylvania really has to deal with, that sort of thing. The Lehigh is a lot cleaner than it used to be, though. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. My mom is 93, and she has lived in Catasauqua for almost her entire life, and she's told us many times that when she was 7 or 8, they would go swimming in the Lehigh River. So this was in the 1930s. And the river was so black with coal dirt at that point that when you came out, you were totally gray on all of your skin, and you'd have to take a bath, and her mother would have to wash her bathing suit every time she went swimming in the river. The mining that did happen here in the Lehigh Valley was mostly iron mines, because what happened here was really important. This was the biggest industrial center of the United States in the 19th century.
Because right now I am using a river that people who are not born yet will be using in a few years.